Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those who are joining us from Africa. In today's press briefing, the finance ministers from South Sudan, Zambia, and Zimbabwe will provide an overview of the discussions they had at the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank this week. I'm Tatiana Mosso with the IMF Communications Department, and I will be moderating this panel. I'm pleased to introduce to you the Honorable Dier Tong Ngor, the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of South Sudan, the Honorable Dr. Situmbeko Musokotwane, Minister of the Finance and National Planning of Zambia, and we have with us the Honorable Professor Mthuli Ncube, Minister of Finance and Economic Development of Zimbabwe. Welcome and thank you to be with us this morning. And before we take your questions, the Minister will give brief introductory remarks. We will get started with Professor Mthuli, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone in Africa. We've had a busy week, a very busy week indeed, interacting with each other here, sharing experiences as ministers, networking. But also we've been meeting potential investors who are keen to invest in our countries. We've been interacting with the staff at the IMF and with senior management. So it's been very busy indeed. It's been a very fruitful week. The message here is clear, which is that we are entering a phase where we are expecting a slowdown in the global economy, largely also partly driven by the hard monetary policy that we're seeing, tightening of monetary policy that we're seeing across the globe without exception in dealing with the specter of inflation that we see across the world. Every other central bank is raising interest rates to deal with inflation and constrain demand. But for us in Africa, basically the inflation is rearing its ugly head again, and in my country there's no exception in Zimbabwe. So the inflation is coming through various channels, through the fuel channel, through the food channel, and the fertilizer channel. On the fuel channel, we've seen the oil price and the subsequent fuel prices going up, and our countries have had to do a few things using stabilization funds to control the increase in fuel prices. In my country, for example, we've been using the strategic tax levy on fuel to moderate those prices. On food inflation, again, some countries in Africa have seen droughts, especially in East Africa. In Zimbabwe, for example, in Southern Africa, we've done rather better on food, but at the same time, food prices have remained high. So when we've had to institute measures to protect the vulnerable by distributing food to those who are vulnerable, and we'll be doing that over the next 6 months. So it's been tough, and it's going to get tougher. That's the message we're getting globally. And of course, as I said, we also in Africa have had to raise interest rates to deal with the specter of inflation. We've had to live within our means in terms of constraining government expenditure by making sure that we have fiscal discipline that won't fuel money supply growth and inflation. So we've done a few things to make sure that we too fall into line with the global economy in dealing with this specter of inflation.
Thank you, Professor. Minister Dier Tong Ngor, please, an introduction remark.
Thank you, Tatiana. Good morning, good afternoon in Africa. I want to add my voice to what the professor has just said. In the last few days, we have had very important discussions on the pertinent topics of inflation, food insecurity, and debt. The current Russian-Ukraine war has indeed increased food insecurity in our countries. And already, even before this war, some countries in Africa, my country included, were already food insecure. And this situation have really unveiled the challenges that we have in our countries, and in particular, the issues relating to limited fiscal space that we have. So it has been very, very difficult for some of our countries to respond to these new developments and a situation of increased food insecurity in the continent, in South Sudan, has increased immensely. Resolving these issues and these challenges definitely will require external support. It will require us to readjust our priorities, but mainly for the immediate term at least, in South Sudan, there will be a need for both humanitarian assistance and at the same time, we would need concessional financing to address these shocks. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Musokotwane, please, do you have any introductions word?
Thank you very much, and once again, good morning and good afternoon. Of course, I want to add my voice to what the two colleagues have already said. They've summarized the issues very well. As we came here, of course, we were already aware of the challenges facing the global economy today, meaning the effects of the war in Russia and Ukraine, the global indebtedness and so many of our countries being pushed in that direction, food insecurity, and so forth. I think what we also came with was the attitude that, yes, there are problems, but we need to find ways of resolving those problems so that we come out of the crisis as quickly as possible. The issues of the debt, it is something that Zambia has been pushing hard on, and I'm sure later on we shall talk about that. But even when we talk about the issues of global food insecurity, it is important to appreciate that in some respect, this is a challenge, but also creates opportunities for many of us in Africa. If you take a look at the grain supplies, for example, there's been so much dependence on Ukraine and Eastern Europe. That is no longer guaranteed. And the world is looking forward to spaces, to areas on the globe where there's space and good agronomical conditions. And we offer those to the world so that we invest into those opportunities and become part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ministers. We are now taking questions from WebEx and the Press Center. If you are joining us from Internet, WebEx and the Press Center, you can raise your hand and ask your questions yourself. If you're joining us from the Press Center, please submit your question there and I will read it out for you and Ministers will take time to answer. So we are coming to the very first question, which is from Rachel Savage from Reuters. Rachel, are you with us?
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Ministers can hear you.
Perfect, thank you so much, Ministers. Would you assess the common framework as a success or a failure at the moment, given that Chad's creditors have said that they do not think it needs debt relief, which Chad's finance minister appears to have disagreed with, and Zambia, Mr. Musokotwane, your process has been quite slow and Ethiopia's has also been delayed. Thank you very much.
Ministers?
Well,
would like to...
maybe I can answer that because we are
Please.
already on the street toward the issue that she's talking about, the common framework. I'll start by saying that we took the view ourselves that this is the only thing that is available at the moment to resolve our debt crisis. I cannot imagine any other route that is available for now. That is what is available, and we decided very early on to embrace that process. It has taken quite some while, because from the time when we decided that's the route we are going to follow, to the time when we should have concluded the debt negotiations, we are not yet there. But I believe that we have gone through some of the important milestones, including getting an IMF program in place, getting the assurance from the official creditors done, and what we are waiting for now is to get to the memorandum of understanding and the actual negotiation. Yes, it has taken too long. It has taken too long, but we are, I think, we're down the lane. But the question that we have to ask ourselves again is, what is the alternative? I don't see any for now. All we can do is to urge our partners, the creditors, to see this as a matter of urgency. That's what we're appealing for. Speed, speed, speed is what we need.
I think we will remain on globally the same question with Shuta Koaka, who is joining us from WebEx, maybe?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please, can you ask your
my
question?
name is Shu Takaoka. I'm working for GG Press, Japanese news agency. My question is also on common framework. And yes, on the effectiveness of a common framework, Janet Yellen, U.S. Secretary of Treasury, insisted China should share his responsibility to make more effectiveness. To make more effective on common frameworks system, and what is your view on her comment?
Minister, thank you for your questions. Minister, if I can, so his question was on the common framework. So how should we fix it to make it more effective?
Well, if I may speak to that again, my colleagues will come in, obviously. So far, the most important thing is speed, because we have been on this road now for more than a year, and we have not yet concluded. I believe that for other countries, I don't want to speak for them, but they have been at it even longer. So we urge all the creditors and all the interested parties. I don't want to start naming names, or I can say that all the interested parties must see this as a vital aspect of bringing the world economy back to normal, because when we have the Africans or whoever it is so heavily indebted, our ability to participate in the global economy is constrained. And obviously that also affects other people who have economic relationship with us. So I repeat, issue of speed, speed, speed is very important.
Professor Mthuli.
Thank you very much. I think really the principle around the common framework is to make sure that all creditors are on the table. The data is already on the table, so we want all creditors to be on the table, and share the burden of structuring the debt for the debtor. So that's the principle. So what I think Janet Yellen is speaking about here is appropriate, given what we're trying to achieve, and trying to make sure that all creditors rank pari passu. They are treated equitably, and they also respond equitably and share the burden in supporting a debtor country, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it's South Sudan, whether it's Zambia. We want all the creditors to be supportive and share the burden in doing so. And as my colleague from Zambia said, Musokotwane, the speed is of the essence. We're going into a very tough time globally in terms of slowdown in the global economy, and we don't want indebtedness to hold back the growth of African countries just because creditors are too slow to do the right thing.
Minister Dier Tong Ngor, would you like to add something?
Our situation in South Sudan is a little bit different because as part of our peace negotiation with Sudan in the past, all the burden of loans are on Sudan and not on South Sudan. But we're supporting Sudan, of course, in the process. So I agree with my colleagues here that the issue of burden sharing is key, and of course the issue of speed. But as we speak, Sudan also is struggling along the same line. Thank you.
We have another question on Zambia and Zimbabwe from Julian Peke. Julian, are you online?
I am. Thank you for taking my questions. Just a quick follow-up on Zambia. Can you talk? We hear you about not wanting to name names, but can you talk at all about the status of talks with your Chinese creditors? But Zimbabwe also, was any progress made this week on international re-engagement? How is the country faring with resolving its unsustainable debt and official external arrears? And could a new IMF program, be on the horizon if you are able to fix those things? Thank you.
Ministers, who would like to
Let me go first on Zimbabwe, on Zimbabwe's debt situation. Well, Zimbabwe's debt situation has got basically different strands. The first strand has to do with what we call blocked funds for investors whose funds were blocked or are being paid very slowly after the currency reform program. For that, we've made excellent progress, and we've begun issuing bonds with a life of anywhere between 2 years to 15 years, 20 years, to make good of what we owe to creditors. So that's going well. That's been resolved. The instruments have been issued, and in fact, we're now looking at perhaps seeing how these instruments can be tradable so that we can use this opportunity to deepen capital markets. The second strand of debt has to do with the debt to the former white farmers, where again we entered into an agreement to pay the farmers and compensate them for improvements on the land. And again, we're making steady progress there. We have again an instrument that will be issuing, which will allow us to pay the farmers over time. The bond instruments, it will be a series of bond instruments that will pay some coupon, so that there's some coupon that's being paid to some of the farmers to make sure they're able to receive something, before the final principal is paid. So again, there is very good progress there. Then the third strand is on the debt to the IFIs, to the World Bank, African Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank. And again, but that is not divorced from the fourth strand, which is the Paris Club debt. What we've done with those two buckets of debt, we've begun to make the token payments to both the World Bank, AFDB, European Investment Bank, and all the Paris Club creditors, 17 of them, will be making token payments to show that we want to be a good debtor and not a bad debtor. That's our attitude in Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. But we're also engaging while we are here with the IMF and the World Bank on a path to eventually clear the IFI debt first before we resolve the Paris Club debt. We've engaged with management. The IMF staff will be in Zimbabwe in December for the Article 4 visit. And then as we go into Q1 of Q2 of 2023, we then have discussions on a staff monitored program, which will clear the path for us to access resources from a sponsor who will help us with bridge funding in order to clear the arrears for both the World Bank and the African Development Bank and European Investment Bank. And then once we're done with that, we'll move on then to deal with the Paris Club, bilateral Paris Club debt, and that too will be structured. So we have a path to that, and we're very pleased that the African Development Bank president has offered to be a champion, play a championship role, to bring everyone together to the table to make sure that we intensify our engagements as we follow that roadmap towards arrears clearance.
Minister Musokotwane, about the part of Zambia on Julian question, please.
Yes, the Chinese, as everyone knows, are one of the major creditors of Zambia. We have been in discussions with them from the time when we entered the process of the common framework. Eventually, of course, we got their agreement, and they contributed to the assurance that was required for the IMF to provide us with their formal program. We remain in touch with them, discussing with them, with all other creditors, reminding everybody that we are not yet there in terms of what we want to achieve, and so far they are coming along. So that is the process that is there. of course, we have to recognize that creditors come with different issues, different interests, because there are a diverse group of institutions. There are countries, different countries. There are also private creditors. Each one of them may have certain perspectives, but it is the duty of all of us who want to see this common framework to succeed, to bring everybody along so that we get to where we want to be.
We received many questions this morning through WebEx, and thank you for this. Please join us on WebEx and the Press Center. We have another question from Raoul Nvulu from Bloomberg. Are you with us, please? I don't see him. So his question was, for how long Zimbabwe Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube see interest rates in Zambia remain elevated for? And does he see any risk of growth stalling in the country? Professor Mthuli.
Thanks for that question. Look, it's quite clear that for us to achieve stability in the Zimbabwe economy, or anywhere, frankly, we have to sacrifice a bit of growth. So we've already reduced the growth trajectory for 2022 and 2021. We have taken that down and tempered that down because we're aware that for us to achieve stability, we have to give up the upside on growth. So interest rates are currently high, and we are watching this space, but we're pleased also that inflation is beginning to turn downwards, it's tapering off, and that's a good thing. We want to get to a point where month-on-month inflation is of the order of, is below 3% per month. 1%, frankly, is preferred, but we know that may be harder to achieve, but that's where we are headed. I think once we see that downtrend in month-on-month inflation being sustainable, maybe over a 3-4 month period, then we can begin to think about lowering interest rates. But for now, the tough monetary regime stands, and also the tough fiscal stance also stands. That's what it takes to bring stability and to bring things under control.
Thank you. Simon Ateba, you are with us, and you have a few questions too. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. My name is Simon Ateba with Today News Africa in Washington, and thank you for taking my question, Tatiana. Ministers, over the past 6 days, we've heard from all these experts at the IMF and the World Bank talk about the economies in your country. For instance, in Zambia, they said that next year your economy will grow by 4%, 2.8% for Zimbabwe, and 5.6% for South Sudan. So is that something that you are seeing there, that you're on the ground? If you can talk generally about what you are seeing there, the state of your economies, the challenges that you've now mentioned, and some of your needs. Thank you.
Minister Dier Tong Ngor, please.
Thank you for the question. Of course, the current environment that we are in is challenging, and sometimes shows, or it tells as if maybe the future would be very bleak. For us in South Sudan, apart from the external shocks, like the Ukraine war, the COVID, still we have our own internal issues that have been affecting our economy in the last few years. For example, the flooding out of our 10 states, 8 are flooded with water. And so in the past, this have impacted really our growth, and almost for a consecutive 2-3 years, the GDP growth in South Sudan has been negative. But we see a positive outlook for the coming years and for next year. That's why we feel maybe the projections that are being made may be reasonable. South Sudan depends mainly on oil production. And as we increase our oil production, and also given the current oil prices, we see a chance that the GDP of South Sudan really can grow, maybe if not by 5.6, it would at least be positive compared to the previous years. Thank you.
Minister Musokotwane.
Yes. That growth is reasonable. It is within reach. But we needed to recognize that we have issues that require resolving now. The issues of the debt, and for us, as I said, we are way towards resolving that issue. The issues of the war in Ukraine and global inflation and so forth, those are issues. But we must also remember that, as I said earlier on, some of these issues are opportunities for Africa. I spoke about the issue of grain exports. That is an opportunity for Africa. I know that Zambia and to some extent my Zimbabwean colleagues there, we produce some minerals that are important for the so-called green economy. In Zambia, we've got copper, we've got nickel, we have manganese, and cobalt. These are minerals that the world will be asking for in large quantities going forward as we turn the world economy to be green. So these are opportunities that we should prepare ourselves for, and we are preparing ourselves for, so that we take advantage and grow out of this crisis, which is also at the same time presenting opportunities. So that's the way that we see things. What is now critical is how do we prepare ourselves as individual countries to take advantage of these opportunities. And that, of course, varies from country to country. But for us, we believe that this is the direction that we must take.
Professor Mthuli, what are the opportunities to take and how Zimbabwe can take them?
Oh, I would say opportunities really are abound in the area of agriculture. That's what Musokotwane has also mentioned, that our countries have fertile land with plenty of water bodies. Zimbabwe alone is 10,000 water bodies, and the opportunity is to invest in irrigation, get that water onto the land, and start growing stuff. We are doing that already. So, for instance, this year, for the first time in 20 years, Zimbabwe will be food secure in wheat. We produce enough wheat for us to consume, and we might even export, depending on our appetite for that. So food production is a great opportunity in our countries, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, and in all our countries that we can think of here. But also the investment in minerals. We all have we're seriously endowed with minerals. I can't think of a mineral that, for instance, Zimbabwe does not have. We have everything from coal, gold, uranium, rare earth, lithium, copper, I mean, everything. And the same pattern is what we see in Zambia as well, at least in Southern Africa. So the great opportunities in the mining sector, I think the issue is about beneficiation, that we ought to encourage these investors to invest in beneficiation so that we can move to a higher level of quality growth. And you know, other opportunities are in infrastructure development, the energy sector investment, whether it's hydro, solar power, it's investing in roads, in airports, all manner of things, one-stop border posts, for example. So the investments abound in terms of opportunities right across most of our sectors in Africa, and investors should take advantage of those.
Thank you. We have another question from Shabtai Gold, who might be online with us. Shabtai, good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to ask a question here. I wanted to ask, one of the themes going through the conference this year was the reform of the World Bank. There's been calls by the United States and Germany for the World Bank to move away from the country-led model of lending and to move towards more regional or global projects. And there's also a greater push for climate finance to come out of the World Bank. And I wanted to get your opinions on the call to move away from country-led lending, and also whether you think it's appropriate for an increased focus on climate, if that would also mean that development finance could not go for natural resources like gas. Thank you very much.
Minister Dier Tong Ngor.
Thank you. I really don't see any contradiction between the two. the country-led model for financing and also the regional model. I think both can work very well. But definitely the moving also to a regional model can help because it benefits a lot of countries. It brings integrations, between our people in various countries. South Sudan have just joined recently the Horn of Africa initiative, which brings together Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And we are latecomers into this initiative. But the countries that were there already have really benefited a lot and have implemented a number of regional initiatives, infrastructure, energy, that can benefit. So for us in Africa, we need more integration because that's one of the challenges that we have. And therefore, regional initiatives, financing, for us really is welcome and should not be seen as a contradictory, to contradict the country model that have been used in the past.
Minister, you agree?
Yes, I agree. I think there's no contradiction there. The issue about, so in other words, country-led, but also regional, because the irony of Africa is that we don't, as you know, we don't trade much with each other. And part of that is because the infrastructure linkages are weak in many instances. Just to give you an example, our neighbor to the west, Angola, they import most of their foodstuffs from Brazil. Can you imagine? And yet, they could import a lot more from within the African region. But for now, there is, for example, no functioning road between Angola and Zambia. I think rail, at the moment, is not, they are making progress to make that linkages. So if you take a look at electricity, there are some countries which have surpluses, either on and off or permanently, but the ability to trade that electricity across the borders is limited. So yes, we need to do more on the region, especially for infrastructure, but that does not mean that it will just be one-way street. No. So this is the way I would see it.
Professor Mthuli, again, another opportunity to work with neighbor countries.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In fact, as ministers in Southern Africa have already begun a conversation, for example, on a regional railway, development network, for example. I've been having conversations with my colleague Musokotwane here, and again, that would be a regional project. It's quite clear that when it comes to infrastructure development, that infrastructure that traverses boundaries and typically does that, we need a regional approach, and I agree with that. But also agree that there's no contradiction with the country-led model because sovereigns need to be treated as in that way. They all have different kind of idiosyncratic characteristics that are peculiar to them, whether they are looking at levels of income, levels of poverty, even some infrastructure deficits, levels of debt. That's for a specific country. So we do need to take into account each country, its peculiarities. At the same time, they're looking to some regional projects. Climate change, the comment about climate change financing is real. We need more climate-linked financing in our countries. I recall the specter of Cyclone Idai, which affected Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi, just ravaged those three countries. And we were able to source, monies from a window from the World Bank. Well, this is the three countries, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, from a regional window because you had this regional impact by this, cyclone. So we need a role for both, frankly, regional and country-led lending.
Thank you. We have another question from Happy Zengeni from Zimbabwe. Happy, are you with us? Not sure he's connected. Anyway, so his question is, with the IMF lowering economic growth prospect for Zimbabwe, is the finance minister going to revise his 4.6% downwards? Sorry.
Oh, well, no, I think we revise it downward, not because the IMF has revised it downward, but because the factors are such that we ought to revise it downwards. And I think that we're taking a cue from what we see around the world in terms of the slowdown in the global economy, but also the tough stance we've taken in terms of tough monetary policy, tight fiscal policy. All those will constrain demand in a way that will cause a demand-driven slowdown in economic growth. So we'll be looking into it and revising it accordingly. But we have to do it because it's the right thing to do, not because someone else has said we should revise it.
Minister Dier Tong Ngor, I see you reacted to this question.
No, for us in South Sudan, I think the projections are reasonable. We see them like that way. In fact, our own projections are more higher than what the IMF putting there, because we feel that as we address the issues of flooding, and also we are involved in a major public financial management reforms, pieces being implemented, so more people will engage in agriculture. We are confident that the projections that are put there are reasonable and achievable.
We have other questions for Zambia and Zimbabwe again. They are awake this afternoon. They are pretty active. So there's been a strike underway by South Africa state-owned ports and railways operator Transnet for more than a week. How much of threat does this pose to the landlocked economies of Zambia and Zimbabwe if the strike continues? Ministers?
Well, both Zimbabwe and Zambia are landlocked countries, but I'm sure my colleague will add on the Zambia front. Well, naturally we'll be affected, but Zimbabwe uses two ports really for bringing in goods into Zimbabwe. There's Beira port, also Maputo port in Mozambique, and then we've got the Durban port, which will be impacted then by the Transnet strike. So any obviously goods that come through that leg, South Africa leg, will be slowed down by the strike. So we are aware of that, but also we have the other leg. For instance, the bulk of our fuel, for example, comes through the Mozambique leg, and I think also Zambia will be affected also in a similar way. So yeah, that's going to happen, but I don't think it's a crisis that really we ought to worry about. Goods are flowing in. Thank you.
Minister.
Yeah, well, you see, strikes are sometimes part of life. These are realities of our life. Whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about Europe, whether you're talking about America, strikes do happen. But overall, this is why the earlier discussion of how we can improve regional infrastructure becomes important.
Yeah.
So that if there's a situation in one route, the other routes should be open. In our case, all those routes that my friend here, Ncube, spoke about, Durban, Beira, we use them, but also we have the Dar es Salaam through Tanzania, also the Walvis Bay in Namibia. But the overall issue is let's work on this regional infrastructure so that it becomes more efficient. And because today it is a strike, tomorrow it may not be a strike. It may be a natural catastrophe, like the flooding that you are talking about. So if you are dependent on one route, then what happens? You have a serious problem.
Yes, right.
So we need to work on this infrastructure. And I think that the international lending institutions, this is one area where perhaps, especially in the past, they do not fully appreciate the need for infrastructure. This is why, of course, when other lenders came on the scene promising infrastructure, those who are affected said, oh, this is exactly what we are looking for. But of course, perhaps they did so with their overzealousness, and but there's no question about the fact that you cannot grow, especially for landlocked countries like us, we cannot grow strongly unless this infrastructure is sorted out.
Thank you. It was a question actually from Matthew Hill, Bloomberg. He's based in South Africa, and will remain with Bloomberg because we have Prinesha Nadu online. Prinesha, good morning or good afternoon.
Good morning. I have a question for the ministers, please. How were the concerns that you expressed on behalf of your countries and peers received by the international community? We often hear complaints that Africa is not at the table when decisions are made. Do you think that's changing at all?
Minister.
Well, I think Africa is more and more coming onto the table, and we are pushing the issues that we think, face our countries to the fore. I represented the Group 1 constituency, the African Group 1 constituency in the DC, and we really also presented our case very strongly, drawing attention that even under the current global challenges, the war in Ukraine, Africa should not be forgotten, and the issues that Africa is facing should be on the table. We made it clear yesterday that we are disappointed that the Development Committee could not issue a communique this year, and it's mainly due to geopolitical issues. We are saying that we recognize, of course, the challenges brought by the Ukraine-Russian war, but there are also wars going on in some areas in the world. This should not stop us really to bring up the issues, to issue the communique that give clarity as to what the development institution should do for Africa. So yes, we have to keep pushing, on these issues that concern Africa. But Africa is on the table.
Minister Musokotwane, Africa is on the table. Is it the time to raise?
Well, the reality is that yes, Africa is on the table, but we have to be honest and say that the weight of Africa at the table is very narrow, especially when you take into account of the fact that it is a continent that is second behind Asia in terms of population, young people, the space. So it lags behind, partly because, of course, our own weaknesses, because our economies have not risen to the appropriate strength. So those with bigger economies, that's the reality of life. They dominate the table. But that does not mean that it should always be so. There is need to listen to us very carefully, especially like the topic that we're just discussing now, how to create the infrastructure that will be required to make these economies to rise up and become part of the global scene. So yes, we are there, but we are marginalized.
Professor Mthuli.
It's a similar view that, yes, we're at the table and increasingly so, but we occupy a small stool at the table rather than the larger stool, because most of the time we are recipients of support, of aid, of resources, as opposed to a giver of those resources to the rest of the world. And that creates an uneven relationship, naturally, even just out of that relationship, an uneven relationship. So, but we should really strengthen ourselves. We should be listened to. I think some of the assistance will be much more impactful if the givers also listen to what those receiving are saying in terms of their priorities. After all, they understand the situation better on the ground. But I must say that, look, I'm hopeful that things will keep improving over time.
As we are coming at the end of this discussion, I would like a word to conclude from you, ministers. Opportunities to be realistic, to be at the table, but more than what we are right now. What will be your conclusion?
I would say the specter of inflation globally is an opportunity for Africa, for us to really start producing more food for ourselves, for the rest of the world. Maybe it's not so much of a crisis, really. It's an opportunity for Africa to step up, and let's step up.
Minister Dier Tong Ngor.
No, I agree. We have huge opportunities in Africa, and I think we also have to be realistic that we need resources, to be able to exploit those resources for the benefit of our people. South Sudan is a land of 650,000 square kilometers. 75% of this land is good for agriculture, but we are receiving aid, and we are asking for aid all the time. I think there is a need for us to ask for more resources so that we can develop our own countries and we can produce food for ourselves.
Minister.
Yeah, I think part of the discussion here that I had with the colleagues was to say, look, we cannot be realistic and expect that the development burden of Africa will be on the shoulders of the institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and so forth. Their resource levels are just too small, okay, compared to the needs. So going forward, one of the things that we should be focusing the lending here, the financing coming out of here, is how can it be catalytical in drawing in private capital? Because it is private capital that is now going to be doing nuts and bolts in terms of which mine opens, which farm opens, which hotel industry opens. That is the private sector. But for now, there's a disjoint between what we get out of these institutions and what will be required for private sector money to draw in and to complement the effect of the public money from these institutions. I think that is one of the issues that hopefully institutions like the World Bank, they need to listen to very carefully and readjust the way they do the business.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ministers, for taking time to join us today. Have a safe trip back home, back in your home countries, and we hope to see you during the spring's meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.